Welcome back, class. I am Professor G, and today we're going to take a second to talk about Judaism. And when talking about Judaism, typically I give some sort of historical primer, like when we talked about India. I gave the history of India before I talked about Hinduism. But with Judaism, we have a special case. That's because the history of the Jewish people is intimately tied with their religion. Judaism is to begin with, is a ethnocentric religion. It's a religion that is centered around a particular group of people, the Jewish people, who come from a particular place, modern-day Israel, Palestine. Okay? So to talk about the history of the Jewish people is to talk about their religion, and vice versa. To talk about their religion is also to talk about their history. And it's their religion that specifically makes the Jewish people stand out. Historically speaking, if we're taking the big view of history, we've talked about some of the world's greatest civilizations. We talked about the Egyptian civilization, talked about ancient Chinese civilization. There is no great, grand Jewish civilization. In fact, the principal reason why we are even talking about the Jewish people is almost solely due to their religion. Now, there will be some great Jewish kings like David and Solomon, but David and Solomon won't have anywhere near the impact that, for example, Alexander the Great will. There's not even a comparison. David and Solomon hardly, if at all, appear in the historical record of other people. That's how, historically speaking, little they mattered. Okay? But we were going to spend some time talking about Judaism because of the impact of the Jewish religion on Western society as a whole. Judaism, as a cultural, religious influence, will remain with Western society and Western culture up until today, due in large part because of the religions that come after Judaism that draw upon the Jewish tradition, namely Christianity and Islam. Both Christianity and Islam are going to share a lot of the same text, a lot of the same stories and traditions and beliefs that originate in Judaism. Okay, so the primary text, the primary source of information, the most holy text in all of Judaism is the Torah, and the Torah represents the first 5 books of the Bible. So this is another thing. So if you were to go to any bookstore, if you go to a Barnes & Noble, for example, and go to the Bible section, you pick up a Bible and you flip through it, and you'll notice that it's divided into 2 parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. For our purposes, and for purposes in general, if you want to be correct about this, the Old Testament, what you should really be calling it is the Hebrew Bible. It's the Hebrew Bible. Old Testament's a bit derogative for Jewish people, implying that it's outdated, outmolded, and this is the center of their faith. So the Hebrew Bible. The most important part of the Hebrew Bible is the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, first 5 books of the Bible, period. Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. And so we can roughly divide this into 3 distinct parts. Genesis refers to the beginning. It's the beginning story of the Jewish people, and the first couple chapters, it's the beginning of everything, right? First chapter of Genesis, in the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth. The first 2 chapters of Genesis are all about creation, about God creating, and also, as we'll see, a statement of who this God actually is, and what the purpose of this God is, and what our purpose is. Because Genesis is the beginning not just of the heavens and the earth, because that's only the first 2 chapters of Genesis, and there are like 40 chapters total. What is the rest of the book of Genesis talking about? It's talking about the beginning of the Jewish people, the beginning of the Jewish tribe, the beginning of their quest for understanding. And the Torah is going to seek to answer some of the most basic questions of the human condition. Who are we? Why are we here? What is our purpose? Who are we? The Jewish people are a people set apart and chosen by Yahweh, by their God. God repeatedly says, I will be your God, you will be my people. The Jewish people occupy a special place on earth, a place specifically chosen by God. So Genesis is the beginning of heaven and earth in the first two chapters, but also the beginning of the Jewish people as a distinct people set apart. Shortly after the first couple chapters, what do we get? Well, you get stories of the flood, the Tower of Babel, this sort of prehistory type stuff setting the stage, these sorts of primordial archetypes that appear throughout ancient myths, ancient religions, also have their place in the Jewish traditions. But the story really starts to focus on the people, and specific people, beginning with Abraham. Father Abraham, if you're familiar in Sunday school, you had to sing the song, Father Abraham, right? So Abraham is the first person, the first individual that is chosen by God. Abraham is called by God to leave his home, to leave everything behind, to take his family, to take all of his possessions, and go to a new place which God has chosen for him, the Promised Land, right? And the Promised Land is a specific place. It's a place in the actual world, modern day Israel/Palestine, right? It's the place that God said, no, this is where I want you to be. It's still there, right? Christians tend to spiritualize this. The Promised Land we typically associate with heaven or something like that. But within the Jewish context, the Promised Land is a specific piece of land. It's all about the land, right? It's all about a specific area of land. So we have to be careful with this, right? We're talking about a specific place. This is a large reason why we're continuing to have these problems in the Middle East, is because all of this land and politics is rooted all the way back here, right? This particular place is the Promised Land. And so Genesis is the story of how the first families, the first few individuals, so we go from Abraham to his son Isaac and Ishmael. The story focuses on Isaac. In the Quran, the story will focus on Ishmael. That doesn't really concern us here. Isaac's son, Jacob and Esau, of course, have their spats and their quarrels. Jacob is going to be the father of the 12 Jewish nations, and the 12 Jewish nations represented by his 12 sons. And one of his sons that stands out in particular is his son Joseph. Joseph is kind of the special child, the child that Jacob starts to pay the most attention to, that Jacob starts to care for the most. And, you know, maybe if you have siblings, you can relate to this. Joseph is kind of the mama's boy, the boy that mom and dad love the most. And so his other brothers are get a bit jealous with this. So they do what I guess any sibling would do. They trick Jacob. They dig this giant pit, tie him up, throw him in it, and selling him into slavery. Right? Didn't play around back then. Sold Joseph into slavery, and Joseph is sold into slavery into Egypt. And so by the time the book of Exodus picks up, the Jewish people are now in Egypt, and the Jewish people, if you read the first couple chapters of Exodus, for various reasons have now become slaves in Egypt. And the story of Exodus centers around this, of the freeing of the Jewish people from slavery by Moses. And so we talked about some of these early tropes. I don't know if I mentioned this in my lecture on ancient Mesopotamia, but there's this trope of the baby that's put in the basket in ancient literature, right? You know, when you see a baby put in the basket and he's rescued, that baby's going to be somebody very important. First, second, or third chapter of Exodus, Moses is put into a basket. Moses is going to become the savior, the leader of the people. It's going to be Moses who is going to lead his people out of Egypt, because it's Moses who is going to encounter Yahweh in the desert. Moses that's going to enter into this covenant relationship with Yahweh, who's going to bring his people out of Egypt. And all of this is sort of building up to the Sinai event, to the place where Moses brings his people out of Egypt and they encounter their God at Sinai. And it's at Sinai, Mount Sinai. It's a mountain. Still there, you can go see it. It's a mountain in which God gives his law to his people, Yahweh. Yahweh brings his people out of slavery and says, now I will be your God, you will be my people. You'll serve Pharaoh no longer, you'll serve me, and you serve me by abiding by my law. Now, Yahweh is a bit different from other gods, a bit different in many ways. And you'll get, I think you'll get a sense of this when we read our selection from the book of Job. But Yahweh stands out for several reasons. And you can really compare and contrast this to any of the number of lectures that we talked about in the past when we talked about ancient Egyptian religion, when we talked about ancient Mesopotamian religion, specifically within the Middle Eastern tradition, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece. The gods, while they may not necessarily be evil, a lot of the gods do some pretty fishy stuff, right? We talked about Isis and Osiris and Set and how they're constantly trying to like undermine each other. You have like civil rivalries even amongst the gods within the Egyptian tradition and within the Greek tradition as well. Yahweh stands out because Yahweh is always depicted as just, as moral, as upright. Yahweh, he does some pretty shady stuff, specifically in Genesis and Exodus, but for the most part, Yahweh's a stand-up guy. He's not doing the same sort of thing that Zeus is doing, for example. Zeus is womanizing for most of the time. He's like turning into swans, trying to seduce women. Yahweh doesn't do stuff like that. Yahweh's also different because of his concern for his people. It's a really interesting relationship that develops between the people and Yahweh. Yahweh enters into a covenant with the people. And a covenant is sort of a deal. It's an agreement. You will be my people. I will be your God. And that's a two-way street, right? You will be my people. I will, if you listen to my commandments, if you follow my rules, if you love one another, if you treat each other with justice, then I will protect you. I will provide for you. I will be there for you because I want to be there for you. This is a God who is intimately concerned with his people. You don't see that with any of the Greek gods. Somewhat with the Egyptian gods, but they're not that concerned. They're not interested in entering in some sort of bound agreement or relationship with the people. Another thing that I forgot to put up here is that Yahweh stands over and against nature. Most other Mesopotamian, Middle Eastern gods are typically associated with some sort of natural event. You have the god of thunder, the god of the sky, the god of the ocean, the god of the river. Yahweh is seen and depicted in those early chapters of Genesis as standing over and against nature. Yahweh can use natural events. Yahweh can inhabit natural events, but Yahweh is not limited to those natural events. He's not just associated with those natural events. Yes, oftentimes he's associated with a particular place, like Mount Sinai or the Jewish temple that they build, but he's not limited by physical reality. Oftentimes he transcends physical reality. He's greater than these particular physical instances. So Yahweh develops a pretty unique character that's distinct from other different religious traditions of the time. Other distinctive aspects are found, what's most famously noted in the Ten Commandments, right? Do not make any graven images unto thyself. Yahweh doesn't want to be drawn. He doesn't want to be sculpted. He doesn't want to be written down. Why? Because Yahweh is bigger than all those things. He doesn't want to be limited. This is a God that can't be put into a box, can't be made into a statue, can't be confined in any way. And he says to try to do this is to misunderstand his character. And as a result, a very different sort of God than the ones that we see throughout the Middle East. Now, the rest of the Hebrew Bible consists of the wisdom literature, part of which you will be reading selections from with the book of Job. Also, the prophets have a very unique place in the Hebrew Bible as well, trying to bring the individuals back to the law, trying to bring the individuals back to the sense of justice. Anyway, I'll make another video talking about the book of Job, talking about the wisdom literature. If you have any questions about any of that stuff, you're more than welcome to email me. See you later, guys.